Hello and welcome to a new camera angle of Arvos of Harvo. We are looking at the shelf here, and this month we have gone through another 7 books. This is going to be a very controversial episode, and I apologize to all the American viewers, but also do I really? Not really. Because the first book on the list is Gone with the Wind, and gosh did I know nothing about this book going in there. I knew Scarlett O'Hara, I knew Frankly My Dear, I Don't Give a Damn. That's all I knew about it. And I picked this up at a thrift store, and just look how gorgeous the edition is. I'm so conflicted about hardcovers with the dust jackets, because I feel like the dust jacket usually doesn't look that good, but when you take it off, the vintage, like, classic look, it looks really cool, but I feel like it's missing a dust jacket. Anyways, starting aside, this is a incredibly long book. It is by far the longest book I've ever read in my entire life. It is 400,000 words, and in this edition, 1,060 pages. It is long. It is very, very long. And it is an epic set in the American South, before and during and after the American Civil War, from the perspective of the South. It was written in 1935, or that's when it was first published, which means that the Civil War had ended for about 60 years since this book came out. Not to say that race relations were repaired by the 30s, they absolutely were not, but slavery had been over for a long while, and sentiments towards African Americans, I would hope, thinking about the past, would have changed by that point, because there had been so much change towards government policy and towards economics. I understand the Jim Crow laws wouldn't be repealed until the 1960s, but at the very least, slavery was over, and we had educated African Americans writing their own literature in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. So for Gone with the Wind to come out and be a book which is pro-slavery, I just can't fathom how this even came out when it did, and how it became such a bestseller. I've heard anecdotes that say that this is the second most popular book in America after the Bible. Like, the amount of popularity this book has, for it to be this racist, is worrying. It's concerning to me. And as someone who's never been to America, I've born in China, lived in Australia all my life, don't really understand the ins and outs of slavery specifically. Even I can look at this and go, hold on a bit, that's a bit worrying. That's really concerning, because we have characters in this novel who suggest that slavery is like the default state of the African American, and we have characters who participate in extremely racist activities, and who just straight up say that they hate various racial slurs, and they're portrayed as good people, or heroic characters. There's just no way of arguing that this novel is not pro-slavery, because the heroes of the novel want to keep slavery. And sure, this is historically accurate to... I don't even want to say that. Sure, it's ideologically accurate to people in the American South before the Civil War. Sure, I understand. People in the South wanted to keep slavery. But to portray them as heroic, and to question the actual mechanisms of slavery so little, and to give so little sympathy to all the black characters, I feel like this book is just such a step backwards in the terms of American history that I really can't recommend reading it. I don't think this is worthwhile for anybody. And I can say that just on the basis of its history and its representation of slavery, don't read it. But setting all that aside, having said that it is extremely racist and really off-putting in how racist it is, let's talk about the actual novel. So we follow Scarlett O'Hara, who is a young woman set in Georgia. She's one of the Southern Belts, right? And one of the key things about Georgia in this time is that for white society, it's very, very based on social standing and manner. So they have a lot of parties, they have families with a lot of money gathering together in each people's houses, and there's a lot of talk in the town about who's going to marry who's about the best suitor for who behaves well, who's from good standing, all of these things. And Scarlett O'Hara is something of the ultimate woman in this environment, because she is a talker, and she's very good at convincing men to fall in love with her. And so that's almost her entire character for most of the book, is that she's going to try and get men to fall in love with her, but she does this, if not for selfish gains, then at least for arrogant gains. She wants to feel like she's successful, and the way that she is successful is that she convinces the most rich, the most powerful, the most influential men to fall in love with her. And early in the novel, she decides to fall in love with and have affection for Ashley Graham, who is actually a pretty interesting character. He's a literary type. He's a southern person, but he has values all around the world. He wants to travel the world. He loves reading literature. He is still extremely pro-slavery, but he's more thoughtful. He's a lot more thoughtful than the average person in his environment. And and Scarlett doesn't like that. Scarlett likes that Ashley is handsome, but Scarlett would rather Ashley not read. She would rather him just be a generic dude who's like a block of muscle and can ride a horse. And so she loves him for no good reason. And the novel's very clear that this is a stupid reason. But he's pledged to marry Melanie, who is, I believe, his cousin, but setting that aside, they're a good match, right? Melanie and Ashley, ideologically, intellectually, emotionally, they're a pretty good match for each other, whereas Scarlett and Ashley make no sense at all. And she's going to spend the entire book pining after this person who, even from the very beginning of the novel, it is so clear to everybody that this is a bad idea. And then it's going to go on for 900 plus pages. You're going to be so frustrated. It's just, I had such a hard time reading it because she's so awful. She's such a terrible person. And often I would think, oh, okay, the thing that's happening to her right now, the Civil War, or having to fend for herself, or like all the various hardships that she goes through, maybe that's going to sympathize her. Maybe that's going to turn her into a person who's empathetic. Maybe it's going to turn her into someone who recognizes that other people go through hardships as well, that she can show compassion for someone else, that she will not make the worst possible decision in the worst possible moment. But just, no. She's so frustrating. And I don't think the book intends for you to dislike or hate or critique her. I think the book thinks that you will forgive her regardless of how racist she is, and regardless of how bad she is to everybody that she meets. And I just couldn't. And I was so glad when it finished, because I could set it aside, I could make a definitive statement about the problematic racial elements of the book. And it's not even about race. The book's not even about race. It doesn't need to have been about race, because the elements of slavery are just not the main plot point of the book. It just happens to have depictions of slavery because it's set in the South in this time, but it is just a love story about Scarlett O'Hara. It's just nothing fits, nothing makes sense. Sentences are so repetitive as well. Often I'll read a sentence and I think, hey, I feel like I've already read this. And I have. It's because word for word the sentence has already existed earlier in the book. It's much longer than it needs to be. It's much more convoluted than it needs to be. The narrative is so simple, and yet it takes so long to get anywhere. And you never root for any of the characters, because they're either Scarlett O'Hara, who's terrible and ruins all the relationships that she's ever been in, or they're other people who are pro-slavery. There's just no light here. There's just very, very little redeeming things. There is a quite poignant moment, and to me this is almost like a stop clock being right twice a day, where there is a couple from, I think, Maine, or one of the northern states, who have come down to visit Georgia after the war, and they treat this African-American person who's been freed. They treat him terribly. They treat him like a subhuman creature, and he is distraught, and he goes to Scarlett, and he tells Scarlett, like, he confesses to her, he goes, I've never been called that in my life. And you can see how much effect it has on him. It's one of the rare moments the book, I felt, had empathy towards people who had been enslaved and people who were freed from slavery, African-American people living in Georgia at the time. The kind of emotional complexity that would have impacted them, that is one of the rare moments in the book where I thought, hey, actually, I think there's something meaningful being said here. And then it just goes back to garbage immediately later, and that's like 10 pages of a 1,000-page novel. If there's one saving grace to this book, it's that it's very transparent. I think that the values here are not veiled, they're not disguised. It's very clear that this is a book that is pro-slavery, that views the American South as a place where slavery was necessary and morally good. And the fact that the book seems to present this, and the fact that people like the book in spite of these values, I think it says something very salient about American society and their relationship to slavery, that they are, in many ways, okay with it, depending on the context. And so it shows how much more work needs to be done in terms of reading and understanding the history and expressing things publicly. I think this book gives a very worrying portrayal of the history as well, because it suggests that African-American slaves were by and large treated well. And there's just so much historical record to say, no, that was absolutely not the case. But to have this book still floating around, and to be so respected as a novel and as a film, it's a bit concerning to me, honestly. And I can only hope that its sheer length deters people from wanting to read this further. I would say don't read this. Absolutely do not read this. If you're curious, look at people who have analyzed it and listen to what they have to say about it, but I would not read this for yourself. This would take so long to gain so little that I would be very happy to see this one kind of fade away over time. So I give it a personal 2 out of 5, because splitting things apart, like, I don't like the racism in this novel. I really, really don't. It made it so much harder to read. But had it not been racist somehow, it still would have been a bad novel. It's still a novel about bad people who act in reprehensible ways, and the book doesn't show the consequences or the development of the character. I thought that what should have happened is one of two things, right? Either Scarlett O'Hara gets the consequences of her actions, and she feels sad, and the audience is happy because it's poetic justice, a bad person got their comeuppance, right? Or, alternatively, Scarlett O'Hara has to change her ways, but she really, really needs to earn a redemption. She needs to go through a difficult moment for herself and learn for herself, this is what it means to change your ways, and this is what it means to behave properly, understanding all the pain that she's caused in the past. And she just doesn't do either of those. It just never comes. You're waiting for a boat or a plane or a train or whatever the metaphor is, waiting for something to come and turn the book around. And so many times I was reading, I was thinking, maybe this is it. And it was never it. So this is a 2 out of 5. Apologies for anyone who liked that book. I'm sure not going to be popular in a lot of Southern American states, but what are you going to do? Next book I read was Breakfast of Champions, because I wanted something to finish really quick and really fast. This is Kurt Vonnegut's... I don't know why I phrased like that. I don't know what number of novel this is. It is a very meta novel. It is a novel about a science fiction author named Kilgore Trout, the character who's appeared in Vonnegut's novels previously. And he is he's a kind of loser figure, really. He sells his stories to pornographic magazines. He's not even aware of anyone who reads them, but he is invited to speak at a science fiction convention by one of the richest people in town, who just happens to love his stories because of all the porn he reads or something like that. And so Kilgore Trout decides to make a mockery of the situation. He decides to go all the way to the festival and to just give the worst speech possible. And you see his journey across America, hitchhiking all the way through to try and get to this festival. Meanwhile, we have a separate character named Harvey something. I remember his name was Harvey because I remember I was going to lose my mind. His name is not Harvey. Meanwhile, I have another character named Dwayne Hoover, and he is a manager of a car retail store. And he's kind of like a middle upper class fellow, quite well for himself, and he is mentally unstable. And so he is going to read one of Kilgore Trout's books and absolutely lose it. This is spelled out for us early in the novel, but the novel continues to develop, and it builds towards this moment, which then suddenly becomes very meta, like super, super meta. Vonnegut himself does a bunch of extra things, and I think I probably should have come to expect that from this author by this point. It's one of the techniques he loves using, is to insert himself to talk about, to reveal the narrative as a different thing all along, and to do all these little silly funny things. Like, this is a novel full of illustrations. There are all these little drawings by Kurt Vonnegut himself, and it leads to a lot of really immature jokes. It's funny, but it's also very bleak and nihilistic. It speaks to me very clearly of the kind of fiction that was coming out in the 50s and 60s and 70s after the immediate understanding after World War II that humanity could destroy itself. And so what else can we do? We can just laugh. But it's not affirming laughter. It's not hopeful laughter. It's if we're all gonna die anyway, why not chuckle about it kind of laughter, which is not my favorite kind of writing. I find it to be a bit bleak and hard to get into, but I also see why it's good, why it's so enjoyable. I think this book in particular does a lot of really funny things with narrative structure, with just phrasing and sentence structure and diction, a lot of techniques there just to make you smile or make you chuckle. And I genuinely did laugh out loud quite often when I was reading this, because of just all that's going on. It's so messy, it's so chaotic, it's just bizarre and really enjoyable. I will say that it's, having come off of Gone with the Wind, I feel like I'm just more attuned to race in any book. This book is not great about its representation of race. It does have African American characters, and they're not treated with a great amount of sympathy either. It's not as racist as Gone with the Wind, but so far I've found that this has been a consistent problem with Vonnegut, because one of the things that made Cat's Cradle quite uncomfortable with for me was its depiction of the native island people in the Caribbean. And so Breakfast of Champions does something similar, where there's passages that make me a little bit uncomfortable, but what can you do? This was the 1970s. This book gets a 3 out of 5. Book number 3 is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. This is the 5th out of the 6 Jane Austen novels that I'm going to read, and then I'm going to make a full video analyzing all of her work. And this one, I had quite high hopes for it going into it, because I've heard it described as a parody of the Gothic novel. And to me, I'm just like, yeah, sign me up, right? That sounds so cool. Because the Gothic novel, when this novel came out, was one of the most popular genres. You had novels like The Castle of Otranto, Mysteries of Udolpho, authors writing sensational stories of ghosts and curses and hauntings and big abandoned castles, and it's a great genre. I really like the Gothic genre. So I wanted to see Jane Austen, who skills-wise is a good writer, try to take it on and to satirize it and to make fun of it, and because it's a very self-serious genre, the Gothic, so I thought maybe it could be a lot of fun. This was not that. This was a regular old romance story, and actually I think it's the first full novel that Jane Austen finished writing, and it was never published until her, I don't know if it was published before or after her death, but it was not published until later on in her career. And it does feel like a very early novel. We have the protagonist, whose name I've literally forgotten, Catherine Morland. She is at Bath, which is this kind of resort area, and she meets someone who she would love to get in a relationship with. And so the novel is about developing that relationship, making friendships with other people at Bath, and then realizing the people are or are not what they are like. Nothing about it is Gothic for the first half of the novel. There's just nothing about it. They have characters who talk about Gothic novels, and the protagonist really likes Gothic novels, but aside from that, nothing happens. Nothing spooky, nothing scary, nothing haunting or dreadful happens. It's just a very normal, very boring romance story, where we still have the same kinds of Austen-like characters. We have exaggerated suitors, we have shallow men and shallow women, we have humor at their expense, and we have a heroine who's just kind of a little bit more thoughtful than people around her. That's, to me, quite standard. Not as good as something like Pride and Prejudice, of course. It's still her developing her voice. But then midway through the novel, Catherine goes to Northanger Abbey, which is the house of the person that she's interested in. And she imagines this whole Gothic scenario for herself, where she's going to this old castle, surely there's like hauntings, she's trying to figure out why characters were here and there and away for periods of the novel. And it's just not it. It's just not a Gothic story, because Austen's whole thesis of the novel is to say that actually real life is nothing like Gothic novels. Real life is not surprising. Real life does not have those crazy curses, consequences, hauntings, any of those things. Real life is just very boring and ordinary. And so she's going to write a very boring and ordinary love story, and then bait us into thinking we're reading a Gothic novel, and then go, nope, you are not. And so, having been baited, I feel like the joke has been on me, because I wanted this book to be something, and it is not that. And I am bitter about it, which means I'm giving this a 2 out of 5. Book number 3, this is A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan? Egan? I don't know how to pronounce her name. This is very postmodern, very unique novel about, well, it's about people. It's about a record producer who it's not even about that. It's about the connections between these characters, one of whom, or a few of whom, are record producers. We start with a young woman who is a kleptomaniac. She steals things when she's out in public. But the next chapter jumps us forward into her boss, and her boss in a totally different time period. And so the novel keeps reorientating us, putting us in the shoes of different characters who are just tangentially connected. But overarchingly, it has this theme of time and the passage of time, where you see one character or one scene in point A, and then you jump 20 years into the future to point B, and the novel's key concern is just how does that happen in those 20 years? How do people change so much? How do people go from being a young person who doesn't care about consequences to an older person who's super careful about everything they do? How do they change, or how do they stay the same? And it uses that core motif of time being a goon, like hired goons, right? Like time coming to your house and forcibly reconfiguring your life in a way that's just out of your control. I thought it was really, really beautiful because the writing style is very energetic and very unexpected. Every chapter, every section does something a little bit different. It plays with perspective, it plays with even the form of the text. There's a PowerPoint presentation in it, and it is the best PowerPoint presentation you will ever experience. I was almost crying by the end of the last slide. Like, it was really, really good. And the structure of the novel is just so interesting as well, because, well, it's not even really a novel, and it's also not really separate short stories. It's funny because a lot of the chapters were published separately before this whole thing was pulled together, but it does work better as a novel because you need to know who these characters are before you meet them again. And yet there are loose ends, there are dead ends, there are sections that don't connect to anything else. There are really weird moments that make you think, how is that relevant to the rest of the text? If you're expecting a straightforward A to B narrative arc, you're not getting it this one. But what you are getting is really intricate portraits of characters and a very insightful understanding of how events in a person's childhood will shape their identity and their behavior and their essence towards later in their life. I thought it was really, really beautiful. It reminds me of those moments where going through your life, you do something and it reminds you that you're your father's child, or you're your mother's child, or you're your grandfather's relative, right? You understand your connection to all the people around you because there's a part of you that is connected to a larger narrative and a larger history. And it's just done so well and so beautifully. The motifs work so well. The jumps into the future were a bit iffy to me because this is a book written in the 2010s, and it tries to predict a near future and gets it right sometimes and gets it wrong sometimes, so it's a bit weird reading this in 2023. But aside from that, I think this is the future of fiction. I think this is genuinely one of the most interesting and exciting books I've read in the last couple of years. And in a world where writing can be more formulaic, in a world where there's things like ChatGPT making up stories for you, I think that this is a way of showing the novel having strength and life going into the future. That there are still so many things you can do with the novel to entertain readers, to excite readers, to be unexpected and unpredictable, and even to include a slideshow, to play with form and structure and character, and still make something that is emotionally resonant and meaningful. This is a 5 out of 5. I am so excited to read the rest of her work. The Candy House, which came out recently, is a continuation of this with some of the same characters. I so highly recommend this. This is a genuinely wonderful book. If you're interested in fiction and the construction of fiction, if you like contemporary fiction and want to see someone just really mess with it, this is a great, great example of that. I very, very highly recommend it. It's a 5 out of 5. Alright, book number 5, this is The Secret River by Kate Grenville. I didn't know what to expect with this. I was really worried that I wouldn't like it because of the whole race theme that I'm going with this month. So this is a novel set in the Darraglands in New South Wales, which is where my family currently resides on. This is about the Nepean River and about convicts from England coming to Sydney and setting up territory there. And it is trying to show the mindset and the psyche of convicts who have a new stake at life in Australia, and how that pride and redemption can put them at odds with their encounters with Aboriginal Australians. I think what's so important about this novel is that it shows contact and interaction between Westerners and Aboriginal Australians, and it shows the varied nature of this, that it was not how do I phrase this? I feel like a lot of the Australian narrative waters down contact between white settlers and Aboriginal Australians. I feel like either people don't like to talk about it because they're going to get into discussions of atrocities and of just crimes that were done by the European colonizers, or they talk about it but they really sanitize it. They just gloss over it. They talk about the farms that were built, the kinds of agriculture that happened, maybe a nice interaction once or twice, and that's about it, right? But this book is structurally about that contact, about a white European named Thornhill who has land for himself. The first time in his life, in his whole family's life, that anybody had a space to call their own. And he names it after himself, and he goes, "This is mine." And this land is hostile. This land does not like to grow the plants and the crops that I want it to grow. And I can whip the land into shape. I can make it do what I need it to do because it is mine. And he just so happens to be living on the river near where a lot of native plants which are edible are present, and that puts him into contact and conflict with the Aboriginal Australians. And it's just difficult. It's such a difficult read because it shows the emotional complexities of this time. We have Thornhill, who is eager to protect his land, but also quite compassionate because he understands that the Aboriginal Australians are human beings, they're people. He sees what his neighbours and other convicts are doing to them, and he's quite horrified at that. He sees the reality of the atrocities of colonization, and he has to recontextualize his own views and his own beliefs on what he's doing and whether or not he thinks is right. That maybe he isn't doing something as bad as his neighbours are. Maybe he's not hunting Aboriginal Australians for sport. Maybe he's not training dogs to seek them out and to maim them. And yet he is taking the land. And so how does he reconcile this? How does he do anything about this? That difficult question is at the heart of this novel, and the novel really does try to discuss it as well as it can from a European perspective. It really helps the author as well has family from the area, and family who lives a very similar life story to the one depicted in this novel, that she was able to go through all this research to actually understand her part in this, and that she has this personal connection to a narrative like this as well. It does feel honest, and it does feel quite painful, and it does that important conversation to make white Australians and migrant Australian consider their role in still the ongoing colonization and erasure of Aboriginal Australian people and history. It's a worthy novel. I think it discusses it quite well. And while it's certainly going to have its problems, many of them stem from the fact that it is from the perspective of a white Australian. And I think practically, because it's going to be so much more difficult to get white Australians to read a book like The Yield or to read a book like The Swan Book, something like The Secret River starts a conversation, and I think that in itself is pretty worthwhile. This is written in a very straightforward and brisk and easy to understand style. It's not overly lyrical, although every now and then there is a sentence that is quite beautiful. I felt that the motivations of the character were the real strong point here. I really, really understood why Thornhill did what he did and why he viewed the land the way that he did. I think that the distance the novel has from our protagonist is also really good, because it's such a difficult situation to be in. We don't want the audience to see themselves as Thornhill, to do everything that Thornhill does. We don't want the reader to be unquestioning of Thornhill's actions. We do need to critique him at some points, but we still come to understand all of his motivations. And to thread that needle and to actually succeed in presenting this character who is flawed and who makes some really terrible choices, and yet we know why he does this and we know the emotions behind these actions, I think that's really the book's strength. So I give this a 4 out of 5. I will say though, if you're interested in Aboriginal Australian history, if you're interested in especially the Darug area, don't read this first. Read Benevolence first. Benevolence is set in the same area. It's by an Aboriginal author named Julie Jansen, and it's a great companion piece to The Secret River because it is about the same area, but we get both voices in this one. I think this one, it's a lot more difficult, it's a lot more harrowing, and it's more about survival, whereas this one is about moral conflicts and starting a new space for yourself. But together, I think they form a really interesting historical portrait of Darug lands in that time. I think these two together, worthwhile read. Okay, and book number 6 is Like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel. This is a Mexican bestseller. It is a romance novel, it is magic realism, it is a lot of fun. I've really, really enjoyed this because it's a novel about... Well, the title, Like Water for Chocolate, is referring to water that you would make hot chocolate with. It's very, very hot water, water that is about to boil over in its pot. And it uses this as a central metaphor to represent romance and love and desire, that those strong emotions are like water at boiling point. They're just about to explode and create steam and create chaos, and that emotion has to go somewhere, has to do something. When a character is so filled up with romance and love and desire, they can't keep it in. They have to do something about it. And that forms the core conflict for this entire narrative. We have... I've forgotten her name. We have Tita, who is, by family tradition, forced to take care of her aging mother, whereas the other 2 daughters in her household are able to marry and go off into their world. And so Tita falls in love with this young man named Pedro, and Pedro decides, because he's also in love with Tita, but Tita can't marry, Pedro decides to marry Tita's eldest sister so that he can stay close to Tita. And this is... it's a decision. The novel is actually really interesting. It doesn't portray it as a good decision or a bad decision. It's just a decision that is made in the throes of passion, in the desire to be with the person that you love at any cost, regardless of social cues, regardless of even goodwill or good logic. It's just... he does it because the heart wants what it wants. And this is a novel about what happens when you live by those motivations and those worldviews, is that if you're governed by romantic desire, what's going to happen? Now, this is a historical fiction novel. It's set... I actually think the time frame is a little bit uncertain, but it does pair up with the... I think a revolution in Mexico. I don't know the history well enough, unfortunately, so I can't really go into it more. But it does have those elements of political and social instability that is paired with this very personal love story. And one thing I love as well is that every chapter is themed around a recipe, and so we get the actual recipe in the text, but the way that it's designed is that the plot point of that chapter is well connected to the thing that they're trying to cook, and we usually have a character actually cooking it. So the act of making the food connects to what the character is feeling at the moment, what the character wants to do, wants to happen, and it becomes a very tactile way of characterizing the people, but also the effect of the food pushes the story further as well. Some of these foods have magical properties because of the emotional state of the person who made them, and so we have really surprising, really unexpected, fantastical moments that just feel like the logical endpoint of romanticizing history and romanticizing relationships, is that if love is so powerful and if love is this transcendent supernatural force, then of course the things that happen in this novel will happen. Of course people will spontaneously cry and feel sick, and people will be carried away into the distance, and all of these unexpected things will happen because love is powerful. And that's what this book wants you to feel, is that at the end of the day, love is an extremely powerful force. And if you're a person for whom that is a theme that you resonate with, then you will like this. And if you're me, who doesn't really resonate with this theme, I can appreciate how it's conveyed. I think it's conveyed quite well. I give it a 3 out of 5. Alright, and last one for the month, I have Birnam by Eleanor Catton. I was recommended this by a friend, and previously I was staying away from this one because I assumed it was going to be like a riff on Macbeth because of the title, Birnam Wood. I thought it was going to be like, Birnam Wood, Dunsinane Hill, Macbeth story. It's actually not that. It's really, really interesting. It's about a kind of, how do I call it? It's a grassroots eco-terrorist-ish group. I wouldn't want to call them that. They're a grassroots ecological group that breaks into unused land, unused properties, especially property owned by billionaires and rich people, and they set up gardens and they set up food banks there, and they grow food and they distribute it in a very equitable way. They are a cooperative, and they are governed by voting systems that... It's very funny. They call it a hui, or hui, which is in Chinese, it just means a meeting or a thing. It's often used to set up loans or other, I guess, unofficial means of accumulated power or accumulated wealth. And to me, it's so fascinating because everybody in Birnam Wood, the group, is white. And it has this little prick of exploring activism, and especially anti-racist activism, when all of your people are white, and how they often use the aesthetics of multiculturalism to further their point, because they are progressives and they are radicals, and radicals are multicultural. But practically speaking, they don't have anybody in their group that is like that. And so they have arguments about what their role is, what is right, and they have an ideological split midway through their group, where one half, wants to be very radical and to like take over things, destroy things, deconstruct things, like really reshape society, and the other half is a more reasonable social democratic method of just redistributing wealth a little bit and making sure that everyone has enough, but also keeping the structures of power the way they are. What's so interesting is, because the actual group is led by our protagonist Mira, even though it wants to be decentralized, even though it wants to have no leaders, Mira is the person who started the group up, and so she's often seen as a de facto leader, which creates problems and conflicts in the group. Now, this is a thriller, though. This is not a political book. This is not a book that wants you to sit there and actually think about real-world events. I'm going to be honest, that's really not what it is. It's a thriller, and the inciting incident is that after a landslide in New Zealand, there is a farmstead owned by a eccentric millionaire that is now going unused, and a billionaire who has bought this property has come to Mira and said, I will give you money if your group come and plant a garden on this territory. And so she thinks, well, that's weird, because why is a billionaire helping out this grassroots, it's the rich organization? And she needs to now convince the rest of Birnam Wood that this is a good idea, they should go there, they should start a garden, and figure out what the motivations of this billionaire are to even give this grassroots organization the ability to start up a farm in this area. It's fast, it's really fast paced. I quite appreciated the way that every little moment feels like it's pushing the plot along, even though it's not a very high stakes thriller. Like, the body count's not very high, there's not a lot of off-the-wall violence or explosions or anything like that, but there is always constantly something thrilling happening, something that is very time-sensitive. There's dramatic irony, where some characters have information that others don't, and that's pushing the story along really, really fast. It does this in a way that's so good that it makes you forget the honestly quite strange perspective issues the novel has. The novel's not really from any one character's perspective. It jumps back and forth, and it shows you the plans of the villains before even the other characters know about it, not to ruin the plot, but just to keep the pace going, to help the reader understand how much danger the characters are in. And it's good. It's really good. I read it very fast. It's not even that small of a book. This edition is 420 pages, and I read it in 2 days. I was going through it so fast, because every moment is relevant. There is no waiting. There is no downtime. Everything is just absolute high-octane, high-speed, not action, but just plot and story. It's going fast, and that's a really enjoyable experience. I so rarely read thrillers, because I feel like the thriller genre is just not it anymore. If you want to be thrilled, why would you read a book? Why, when you can watch a movie or play a video game? Those mediums are more attuned to thrilling audiences. So to actually go out of your way to write a thriller in this day and age, to me, is quite a daring move. And the thriller genre in fiction is also really held back by now literary fiction and even contemporary fiction's insistence on conveying themes and conveying messages. Thrillers are just not very good at doing that. Thrillers tend to make readers forget about what happened immediately before, because they need them to be constantly fixated on what's happening next. I think that's what's happening here in Birnam Wood, is that they are certainly compromising some of their political and economic statements by making it a thriller. You do feel like you haven't had the full picture or any of the real thematic elements fully answered. You just get a resolution to the thriller. And I think the problem with thrillers too is the resolution is always a bit of a downer. The way that a thriller works is that it keeps the audience uncertain of what's about to happen. It presents a few different scenarios, and one of them is a really bad one. And the moment it becomes clear what's going to happen, the moment when the reader stops guessing what's going to happen next, the thriller just falls flat. It absolutely falls apart. So Most thrillers, I find, rush their ending. They want to get it out as fast as they can, and they want to keep the reader in suspense for as long as possible, and just hash out the ending and just leave. And this novel does that as well. So, do I wish that it was more clear about its thematics? Yes, certainly. I would have been much more interested to read about this guerrilla gardening group in more of a political lens. But was that the best choice for this book? I also disagree. I think the book works well as a thriller. It works well as a book that you can recommend to somebody else and say, hey, it's themed around radical ecological protests. But really, it's a book that you can just sit down and read and really enjoy. So I give it a 4 out of 5. Alright, and that's everything for this month. I've got 6 good books and one very bad book. So don't read this one. Do read this one. Thank you for joining, and I will see you guys next month. Goodbye.